Hello my friends, welcome back to building an automated machine learning pipeline on Lambda. Now I'm super excited because we're about to start coding the whole pipeline, but about that you actually have two options. If you want to recode everything with me, well, I invite you to watch the next 6 tutorials and recode all the code sections with me. Or, if you don't want to code the whole pipeline, then in that case just watch this tutorial because it will contain some important things that we'll do with the environment variables that we actually have to do in the console, and then you can skip the next 5 tutorials, okay? Because once we're done with this implementation, we'll just copy paste the whole code into our Lambda function, and then we'll do the rest of the pipeline with the triggers and destination. All right, so there you go. If now you want to stay with me and code all this, well, let's do this. Let's smash this code together. Alright, and our first step here is to define the environment variable. So, why do we have to do this? What are the environment variables? Well, that's simply because, right now we want to create a code that works for everyone, for all of us. However, since all of us have different bucket names and, more specifically, different data bucket names and model bucket names, because S3 bucket names have to be globally unique, so we had to add this random number just so that we all have different bucket names. Well, in order for this code that we're about to implement to work for all of us, well, we need to define those environment variables which will contain exactly those differences in the bucket names that we have, but in the same variables. And these variables are the environment variables, okay? So basically with these environment variables, we're about to make a dictionary in which we will have the exact same keys, we will all have the same keys in our dictionary, but the values in our dictionary will be different, and the values will be exactly our bucket names, or S3 URLs that we will need indeed then to build the pipeline. Because indeed, let's have a look at the pipeline again. Since Lambda will read your data in S3, in your S3 data bucket, and since it will save the model in your S3 model bucket, well, indeed, we will need the URL of your data object in S3 and also the name of your model bucket, okay? So that's exactly the reason. That's in order for this code to work for all of us, but despite having different bucket names, okay? So that means we have to define 2 environment variables. The first one will be for the URL of our data object in S3, which we're going to call data underscore S3 underscore URL. And in order to get that value from the dictionary, which I will show you in a second, by the way, well, we're going to use the environ function from the OS library, which I remind is a library that provides functions to interact with the operating system in Lambda. And so let's call this library OS, from which, as we said, we're going to call the environ function. And inside that function, we simply have to enter in quotes the name of the key, not the value, but the key, which we're also going to say to be data S3 URL. So here, not to confuse, data S3 URL is just the name of that new variable we just created and which will contain the URL of our data object in S3. And this is the name of the key in the dictionary that we're about to define in Lambda. And well, we will do that in 1 minute, just after we're done with the other environment variable. So that's why I'm copying this now and then pasting it below, because we have a second environment variable to define, which, as you might guess, will be for the model bucket. But here, since we just need to save our future machine learning models in that bucket, well, we don't need a URL, we just need the name of the bucket. And therefore, that second environment variable, I'm going to call it model underscore bucket underscore name, right? Model bucket name, and then inside those quotes here, same, I'm going to call it model bucket name. And here, that's the same. This is just the name of the variable we've just introduced and which we will use in our implementation. And this is the name of the key in that dictionary we're about to create in Lambda, which will give as a value the name of our model bucket. All right, so now that we're done defining those environment variables, well, let's make things super clear in Lambda, because what we're about to do now is exactly to define the dictionary. So back into our Lambda function, I'm going to show you now how to create the dictionary, which will be exactly those 2 environment variables. So to create those, you scroll down a bit to access again your code, and you're going to go to configuration. And there you go, that's where you can configure many features here, like some general configuration, which, by the way, we will configure because we will have to increase the timeout of running your code, because indeed it will take more than 3 seconds to train a random forest model on our dataset. And so actually, let's do that super quickly. Let's click edit, and let's just increase the timeout to, let's say, 59 seconds. 59 seconds will be way enough, and that's all we have to do in the general configuration. All right. So perfect, done, successfully updated the ML pipeline Lambda function. Now let's go back to the configuration. And now according to you, where do we have to go to define the environment variables? Well, that's of course going to be right here in environment variables. That's exactly where we're going to define our dictionary. So let's do this. We click edit here. And there you go. We simply click then add environment variable. And as you can see, that's where you define the dictionary with first the key and the value. So now please press pause in the video and try to create the first environment variable by providing the exact key and the value for, let's say, our first environment variable, which is the URL of our data object in your S3 data bucket. All right, I hope you did the little exercise here. So now I'm going to provide the answer. So because we called our key here data S3 URL, I told you that's exactly the name of the key in that dictionary for which the value will be the URL of our data object in S3. Well, that's exactly going to be our first key here. So that's what we enter in the key. And then for the value, did you figure it out? Well, in order to find the value, we need exactly the URL of our data object in S3, which is of course our CSV file in our ML pipeline data bucket. So we go inside the bucket, and in order to find that URL, you have two options. Either you select your data object here and you click copy URL, all right? So that will get you exactly what we need right now, which is the S3 URL of your data object. Or the other way is to enter the object, and then you will also find the object URL right here. So you click copy again, and this gives you exactly the S3 URL of your data object, of course, in S3. Okay? So there you go. That's exactly what we need. We go back to Lambda now, and we paste the value. Perfect. And now let's add the second environment variable for our model bucket name, right? Indeed, since there is no particular object right now in our model bucket, and we will just use that bucket to save the model. Here we don't need a URL, we just need a simple name, the name of our bucket. And so, what did you have to enter here for the key? Well, of course, that's the key name we entered here in our code, model bucket name. And so, back in Lambda, we paste that in the key. And then, what is the value? Well, that's super simple. That's, of course, going to be the name of your model bucket. So back into our bucket, I'm going to simply take the name of the model bucket here, ML pipeline model bucket with your random number. We copy it, and then back in Lambda, we paste it. And there you go. Now you have your two environment variables so that the code that we're about to implement all of us will work for all of us, despite each of us having different data bucket names and model bucket names. Okay? That was the whole purpose of defining those environment variables. And so now let's finish this. Back in Lambda, let's click, of course, here, save, so that we can get indeed our environment variables successfully updated. Perfect. And now, before we wrap up this tutorial, I just want to show you something. If you go back to your code here, and if you go to the environment variables tab here, and then if you press here, Command and Control Shift E, and there you go, by pressing this, you will get indeed the list of your environment variables. So make sure you have exactly this, well, with your different bucket names. And if that's the case, well, you're ready to move on to the next tutorial for that next code section on how to define a function that imports the dataset.
Now make sure to check out these videos on the right or the full course in the description to continue your learning, and I look forward to seeing you there.